The snow had been falling since before dawn. Liam stood at the edge of his property and looked at the sky. The way a man looks at something he knows is not going to negotiate. Flat, gray from horizon to horizon. The kind of Alaskan October sky that does not threaten winter and announces it. He had been here long enough to know the difference. 19 years in the interior teaches you to read the air the way other men read clocks, the particular weight of it, the way the cold settled differently in late October than it did in September, heavier somehow, more deliberate, like a decision that had already been made somewhere above the clouds. And right now, the air was telling him the same thing it told him every year around this time. Whatever you have not done yet, you had better have done. But Liam was not worried about his wood. That was the thing most people around here still could not quite believe. Every fall, without fail, the same conversations happen in town. At the hardware store, at the fuel depot, at the counter of the diner on Route 3, where the old guys nursed their coffee and traded complaints like currency. The wood is wet. The wood is not burning right. I went through half my supply in November, and I have no idea how. I stacked 4 cords, and by February I was down to nothing. And Liam would listen and nod and say something non-committal, because he had learned long ago that there was a particular kind of man who asked about your system, but did not actually want to change his own. The asking was social. The changing was a different thing entirely. The information was not secret. It never had been. It was just old. And old things have a way of getting buried under the comfortable assumption that newer must mean better, that a blue plastic tarp from a hardware store must represent some kind of improvement over whatever people used before plastic existed, that modern problems require modern solutions, that if the old ways were actually better, someone would be selling them. That last assumption was the most dangerous one. What Liam knew, what Walter had put into his hands on a -22 morning decades ago, was not complicated. It was not a product. It could not be patented or sold or packaged in a bag with a logo on it. That was probably exactly why no one in the firewood supply industry had any interest in promoting it. Wetwood sells twice as much wood. A man who burns inefficiently burns more. A man who runs out in February buys an emergency cord at peak winter pricing. There was no money in telling people the truth about moisture content and airflow, and what a tarp actually does to a woodpile over the course of a winter. There was enormous money in letting them figure out the hard way, year after year, and come back to the supplier each time. Liam was not a conspiracy-minded man. He did not believe in elaborate plots, but he had watched enough people struggle with a problem that had a known, proven, centuries-old solution to conclude that ignorance, in this particular case, was being allowed to persist in conditions where it happened to be profitable. That was not a conspiracy. That was just how markets worked when the customer's failure was more lucrative than their success. The old-timers did not use tarps. They did not use them because tarps did not exist, and so they had been forced by necessity to actually understand the problem, not the surface of the problem, not just keep rain off the top, but the whole problem, the complete moisture environment of a woodpile through a 6-month winter in a climate that went from wet fall to frozen January to thawing March and back again. They had understood it because their lives depended on getting it right. A man who ran out of dry wood in the interior of Alaska in February was not inconvenienced. He was in serious danger. That kind of stakes produces genuine understanding. And genuine understanding, passed down carefully through generations, produces a system that works. Liam had not arrived at that system easily. His first 3 winters in the interior had been educational in the specific way that only genuine suffering can be educational. Not the kind of learning you seek out, but the kind that finds you. The first year, he had done what every newcomer does. He had stacked his birch along the north wall of the cabin, thrown a blue tarp over the pile, weighted the corners down with whatever heavy objects were nearby, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who was prepared. He had stood back and looked at it and thought, that is handled. By January, he was burning with that hissed at him. By February, he had cracked a baffle plate in his stove from running hotter than it was designed to run, trying to compensate for a fuel that had the energy density of a wet sponge. He burned nearly twice what he should have burned and was still cold at night. The tarp had pooled water at the low points. The ground underneath the stack had wicked moisture upward steadily through October and November. What he believed was seasoned birch was, by midwinter, something closer to a slow-burning source of steam. The second year, he built a lean-to. It was better. The inner core of the stack stayed reasonably dry through December, but the outer courses, the wood he reached for first because it was right there at the front, were soft and slightly spongy, holding moisture from the wind-driven snow that reached them through the lean-to's open sides. He ran out 2 weeks before the last serious frost, burning wood that he could feel was wrong every time he loaded the stove. The third year, Walter walked him through it. Walter was not a man who explained things in lists or diagrams. He explained things by showing you, and then letting the showing do the work before he added any words. He had opened the door to his woodshed on that -22 morning and simply stepped aside. And the interior of that shed had made its case without any help from Walter at all. The smell was the first thing. Properly dried birch has a specific smell, papery, faintly sweet, with a clean mineral edge, and it is entirely unlike the damp, heavy mushroom cellar smell of wood that has been holding moisture. Liam had walked through the door and stopped, because the air inside the shed smelled like the opposite of everything he had come to associate with his own woodpile. Then Walter had pulled a piece from the middle of the stack and handed it to Liam without saying a word. It was light, genuinely, surprisingly light. Liam had hefted it and looked at the old man. "That's been in here since April," Walter said. "Feel the difference?" Liam did, and that was the beginning of actually understanding the problem. The 3 enemies, Walter said, in the order they actually mattered, ground moisture first, because it was the most invisible and the most continuous. A woodpile sitting directly on soil was in constant contact with the moisture table beneath it, not just when it rained. Always. Even frozen ground released humidity through temperature differentials. Even a gravel pad would wick condensation during the daily freeze-thaw cycles of early and late winter. Even a concrete slab, which many people believe was a dry surface, would pull moisture into the bottom course of the stack during any period of temperature change. The only solution, the only one that actually worked, was real airspace between the bottom of the pile and whatever surface it rested on. Not an inch, not 2 inches placed there by a single layer of pallets. A genuine, maintained elevation of 8 to 10 inches, with enough space beneath it that air moved freely in every direction. Liam had rebuilt his entire base that spring using treated lumber runners, set level and spaced 18 inches apart. The difference the following fall was not subtle. The bottom third of his pile, which had always been the worst what he had, the first to show mold, the last to dry, the pieces he dreaded reaching, came out of storage clean and light and indistinguishable from the middle of the stack. That single change, affecting nothing above the first 8 inches, had transformed roughly a cord of wood from marginal fuel into good fuel. Every year since, he had thought about how many people were burning bad wood from their bottom course without understanding why. Airflow second. This was the one that contradicted every instinct, and it was the one that the tarp completely destroyed. Wood dries by releasing moisture into surrounding air. That process only works if the surrounding air is moving, carrying the moisture away, replacing it with drier air, and allowing the wood to release more. A stack sealed on all sides by a tarp, bark side out, pressed against the wall, was a humidity system in reverse. The moisture the wood was trying to release had nowhere to go. It rose to the tarp surface, hit the cold plastic at night, condensed into water, and dripped back down into the stack. By sealing the pile, the tarp was not protecting the wood from moisture. It was recycling the wood's own moisture back into it on a daily basis. The wood never dried. It just stayed wet in a sheltered location, which was not the same thing at all. Liam had stopped using tarps completely by his 5th winter. He had learned to stack with the cut faces of the wood, the cross-sectional end grain, pointing outward, because that was where moisture left the wood. Bark was designed to resist moisture transfer. It was, by its very nature, a barrier. Stacking bark out sealed the drying face against the air. Cut ends out meant the part of the wood that could actually exhale moisture was exposed to whatever breeze moved through. He left 2 inches of space between the rear of the stack and any wall it backed against to prevent dead air from accumulating behind it. Small things, simple things. Things that cost nothing except the willingness to think about the problem clearly. The roof third, a real roof, not a tarp, not a lean-to with gaps at the sides, but an actual pitched structure with overhangs deep enough to matter. The reason every traditional woodshed design across every cold climate culture looked essentially the same, posts, frame, pitched roof, open sides, was not aesthetic. It was functional. The pitch shed snow before it could accumulate to a damaging weight. The overhangs protected the face of the stack from wind-driven precipitation, while still leaving the sides open to air movement. The open sides were not a flaw in the design. They were the entire point. Air moved through the stack continuously, day and night, summer and winter, carrying away moisture and replacing it with dry air. The wood inside did not just stay dry. It continued to dry actively throughout its time in storage. Liam had built his shed in the spring following that conversation, and he had refined it steadily in the years since. He had learned that orientation mattered, that pointing the open faces of the shed perpendicular to the direction of worst weather meant prevailing winds swept through the stack rather than driving snow into it. He had learned to keep his birch and his spruce in separate sections, because they dried at different rates and burned best at different points in their seasoning cycle. He had learned that rotation was not optional, that new wood in the back and old wood in front was a rule that had to be followed every single spring without exception, because the temptation to just add to the front of the pile was the silent killer of more seasoning cycles than any weather event. And he had understood, eventually, that all of it was meaningless if he started too late. Wood cut during the growing season was full of sap. A tree felled in May carried the maximum moisture load of its entire annual cycle. The old-timers felled in October. After the first hard frost pushed the sap into the roots, they split in early spring. They stacked in May. They burned that with the following winter. 14 months from tree to stove was a minimum. 18 was better. Some of the old homesteaders Walter had learned from ran 2-year seasoning cycles without exception, never burning anything less than 24 months old. Liam had never gone quite that far, but he understood the logic, and he understood why there was no shortcut for it. There was no product that replaced time. There was no tarp, no shed design, no stacking method that could compress 14 months of drying into 4. You either started early enough or you didn't, and if you didn't, you paid for it in February. Standing at the tree line that morning, watching the snow come down heavy and steady over the valley, Liam was thinking about Carl. Carl was 28, had come up from Anchorage 2 springs back with good intentions and a genuine desire to live differently. He was not a careless man. He had worked hard on his place all summer, and Liam respected that. But Liam had stopped by in September and seen the woodpile, and the image had not left him. The blue tarp, weighted at the corners, wood on the ground, bark facing out, stacked tight against the south wall of the cabin. Everything wrong, in precisely the combination that guaranteed the worst possible outcome by midwinter. He had said nothing then. Carl had not asked. That was the rule Liam lived by. Unsolicited advice in Alaska was rarely received as the gift it was intended to be. But the snow was falling hard now, and there were 4 months of serious cold still ahead, and there was a difference between respecting a man's autonomy and watching him suffer through ignorance when you had the thing in your hands that could fix it. Liam walked back to his shed and pulled 6 pieces of birch from the front of the pile. They were light, that specific, unmistakable lightness that came from wood with moisture content below 15%. He could smell the faint sweetness of them in the cold air. He stacked them in his arms and turned toward the truck. He would drive over. He would hand Carl the wood and let him feel it. And if Carl asked, if he actually wanted to know, Liam would tell him everything. The 3 enemies, the elevation, the airflow, the roof, the timing, all of it, the way Walter had told him, the way it had been told before Walter. That was the only way this kind of knowledge survived. Not online, not in comments, person to person in the cold, with good wood in your hands and a fire that either burned right or didn't. Liam loaded the birch and started the engine, behind him, for cords of perfectly seasoned wood sat in the dry, moving air of the shed, ready for whatever February decided to bring. It always was.